This is Brass Tactics, policy and strategy for the people, not the politics. Welcome back to Brass Tactics. As usual, I am still Joe McGiffin, and today with me I still have one Peter Mitchell. But as a special, new, unique opportunity, we have a very rare appearance of a special guest. Today with us is Charlie Faint. He is not only the chair for the study of special operations at the Modern War Institute at West Point, and he's also the owner and founder of the Havok Journal, the voice of the veteran community. Charlie, thanks for joining us. Pete, hi.
Joe and Pete, hey, thanks so much for having me on the show. I'm a big fan of brass tactics. Really looking forward to the discussion tonight.
Thanks. That puts you in rare company with my mother and occasionally Pete's wife.
Good company. Good company to keep.
Glad to be growing a community. So, tonight's topic, we were going to talk about a really common acronym. So, for those of you who may be joining us for the first time or who have been with us so far, Pete and I have mostly argued about the history of war, the philosophy of military theory and how we look at war, and some of those big forces that move political science. And this is going to be another one of those episodes. We're laying some framework right here. This is what, a week and some change since Tucker Carlson's Putin interview, which is a really cool one, which we're excited to get into. But some of these big mechanics I think are really important to understand before you start trying to piecemeal or really delve into specific topics like this. And today's topic, called DIME-FIL, called also midlife, it's an acronym that's aimed to help you understand how states, specifically how the United States in particular, because I think that it originated with us, as do most things that people have issue with, view their capabilities in terms of foreign policy. And so this original acronym stands for, the D is diplomatic, I is information, M is military, E is economic. And that was the original one, was DIME. And then later on, mostly during the prolonged counterinsurgency conflict of the war in Afghanistan, we added a few other ones that were generally associated with state building, but that doesn't imply that they're limited there. And that was financial, which I'm going to let Charlie explain how that's different than economic, because I personally still don't see a difference. Charlie, the extent of my capabilities with either economics or finances, I make sure there's more coming in from the paycheck than going out each month, and that's about what I can manage.
You're doing better than most governments around the world if you're doing that, Joe. Well done.
And so, yeah, and that leaves I for information, and the last one is L for law enforcement. Charlie has spent the better part of his academic career with a heavy focus in this sort of arena of the foreign policy community with these basic building blocks. So, Charlie, does this acronym work out, or is this something that is just setting up limitations for how we can re-envision foreign policy capabilities?
So, Joe, I'm thrilled that you and Pete have asked me to discuss this. This is something I've been interested in for a very long time. As I mentioned before the show, the article that we're talking about right now, my midlife article, something I wrote about 12 years ago. I was first exposed to the dime construct when I was in graduate school, and I thought it was useful at the time. And if any of your listeners or you fact check right now, you can Google dime and President Obama, dime and President Trump, dime, and just about anybody, and you'll see them refer to it all the time. They were usually in the context of we have to use all of our instruments of national power, the diplomatic, information, military, and economic, and they normally say that right before they default on the military and economics. It's really just like it's like, hey, we got to use all the instruments of national power, and we're sending the Marines. That's normally how it works. It's something like that. So just backing up a little bit on dime fill, the second I stands for intelligence. So it's information in dime and it's information and intelligence in dime fill. I thought building out the fill part to dime was useful because there's far more. Dime is too simplistic if you really study strategy or if you study international relations or politics. But I think that was insufficient also, which is why someone other than me came up with midlife. I like that acronym better than dime fill. I think midlife is less cumbersome. But I think that we overlooked a number of other instruments that can be and are used, and limiting ourselves to dime filler or dime in particular overlooks a whole bunch of other things we could be.
It's this is an imperializing concept. I was exposed to this the first time in grad school, just like Dr. Faint was. But just a year or so ago, I was watching a lecture at the Maria Theresa Academy in Vienna, Austria, and the Austrian army colonel starts discussing the war in Ukraine, the Russo-Ukrainian war, and he says we need to look at this through the appropriate lenses of national power in German. But then he flips to a new slide that says in English, dime, diplomatic, informational, military, economic. And then in German is briefing this slide, which he clearly got from some American officer or whatever, just translating it for his audience. Like, this is the way things are, right? This is the way it's supposed to be done correctly. This is the standard. That was that blew me away because it's just like it's shocking to me because like there was no independent twist on it. There was no Austrian riff on dime. No, we're just going to take dime the way that the Americans say it is, and we're going to accept it and then look at the war through that lens.
I mean, we took mission command basically from them, so I guess it's just fair play for that they borrowed dime from us, so it's all good. So I think it's very
That was the northern Germans, Charlie, not the southern Germans, right?
wait, there's a difference? So
Yeah, they were neutral during the war. They were
right, right.
neutral.
So I think dime is useful. I think dime fill midlife, however we want to look at it. I think there's utility in that. I think a lot of like a lot of things though, we get overly focused on it and neglect everything else that could go into it, especially when people pay lip service to it. Like I mentioned earlier, I was not really joking when I was joking about how we talk about dime fill before we fall back on me, the military economic. But I think it's useful to get people thinking about it. It's certainly useful for me when I was first starting out, and Pete, maybe same for you. When I was first exposed to it, I was like, oh, wow, this is really great. When you start unpacking it, you start to find limitations.
So a couple of episodes ago, Joe and I discussed the evolution of U.S. Army doctrine all the way up through the 1970s and 80s. Dr. Fan, could you enlighten us about where dime fill midlife kind of comes from? When does it first come up on the scene? Or do you know like the roots of the of its conception or its broad acceptance?
Yeah, so I was actually looking this up before we went on the show. I was like, I bet someone's going to ask me about this. So this has been a thing in international relations theory for a long time. So I don't know when it first started. At least at least 4 presidencies ago, because in my article that I wrote, as that's how far I was able to go back. So it's been around quite a while, and any framing is reductive, but I think it's necessary, especially when you look at strategy and all the things that a nation state, especially one as powerful as America, can do, all the levers we can pull. We've got to frame that and explain it in a way that it's digestible. Especially when all three of us, if we just say, here is everything you need to think of, because you all have that background and ability, it'll blow their minds and it'll shut down and they'll be convulsing on the floor and never learn anything. So I think we can start them with something like this, like, okay, I understand dime. Now I can move into this. Now I can move into this, and eventually they can become like Pete. And I noticed the humble brag there, Pete, of how you were going back and forth between German and English in this thing. Very well done.
Oh,
Well done.
yeah.
Well done.
Pinkies out, y'all. Pinkies out. So, Charlie, on the note of understanding dime, I don't want to run the risk of not making this as transparent as possible for those of our listeners who are outside of the community of knowing. So, maybe we could just quickly unpack. I know I listed them, but maybe we could just unpack what we mean by elements of national power and how these help to frame.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to skip straight to midlife, which is my interpretation of the evolution of dime fill. And again, I didn't come up with midlife; someone else did. I don't know who to credit for it. I'm just saying that it wasn't me. But I did put some original thought into what I think are the most significant elements of organizational influences, is how I refer to them. And I know we're going to talk about non-state actors here shortly. But specifically, we have the military, which is pretty standard. I think everyone intuitively understands what the military is. Information is not much different than dime, except to emphasize that it works both ways. You have stuff you want to protect and stuff you want to get. Diplomatic, no change there. Legal is is a lot of people refer to this as lawfare. You see this going on right now with Hamas and Israel in terms of sanctions, embargoes, boycotts, those types of things. Go ahead.
That's kind of famously associated a little bit with China as well, right? With the island buildings in the South China Seas and generally poking at conventional borders.
Well, I don't think it has legal at all. I think that it proves the point that I was bringing up earlier about the only things that matter in this whole process are military and economic. Because we've threatened all kind of legal action against China. They steal our IP, they copy all our things, and we do little to nothing about it. The only thing that does work against ultimately against anybody, but especially large powers like China, are the coercive elements of military and economic. That doesn't mean everything else is useless. In competition, a lot of these things are very useful. But when conflict kicks off, these are all the things that we should be doing, and a lot of them that we aren't. And that brings us to the next element, identity. And when I wrote this, identity was not nearly as much as important as it was right now. It's not nearly as talked about. But when we look at identity, we're talking about race, religion, ethnicity, gender, political party, ideology, things that you choose for yourself or society imposes at you that can either bring together individuals or set them apart for whatever reason. And I think as America, we do a poor job of that when we export it to other nations. We do a poor job of tapping into identity as a weapon for ourselves. Financial, Joe, you asked about the difference between financial and economic. And financial, the way I explain it, it refers specifically to the monetary system. Okay, we can't have an economy if we don't have money, but finance I think is important enough to have its own category exclusive of economic. And I'm thinking back when I was in JSOC, and one of the ways that we would get after the bad guys is have this financial task force, these super smart people that could track down the money, follow the money to get after the bad guys. And we could see now, like when Russia went into Ukraine, one of the things that we did was attack them financially. And the economic is simply the medium of exchange for goods and services. So that's the macro level compared to finance. So that's in a nutshell. That's midlife.
Okay, yeah, no, I think that's a great summary. So, it's a way to frame the different ways states wield power or influence in order to get after something they want in the international community, right, wrong, or indifferent.
Right. And not just states, anybody can do that. Anybody could do these. And I know, I imagine we're probably going to get into a discussion about non-state actors here, probably right now.
I mean, especially reading your article and also just reflecting on it, it's the non-state actors that really drive that identity realization in a way I think that wasn't really seen before. Because when when you foreign policy, well, IR, international relations, or the study of political science in general was taking off in the mid to late 20th century, it was all focused around state versus state, and it stayed like that until non-state actors started making significant waves in the geopolitical realm.
Is it because then non-state actors, because of their relatively weaker economies and militaries, have to rely on other levers of dime fill in order to make up the gap?
I think that's a great question, Pete, and a great observation. I also think that it's easier for non-state actors to do it now, but certainly they were doing it in the past. Was it Gavrilo Princip? I mean, certainly we've got examples of non-state actors exercising all type of power in the past, but in the past, you probably didn't have many entertainers that were billionaires. You probably didn't have the type of mass communication that we do now, that ability to influence directly and indirectly. So I think it's easier. That's why we're seeing it so much now. It's easier to travel, it's easier to talk to people, it's easier to make and send and use money. So I think we've had it in the past. It's just more now because it's easier.
The state's monopoly on violence is shrinking due to the postmodern information era.
So you say non-state actor. The first place I go is the Taliban and Al Qaeda and Osama bin Laden.
Well, Taliban's definitely a state actor right now, Joe.
Yeah, well, but when these things originate largely in our attempts to rationalize, understand, and prepare to defend against a potential another future threat, like what happened on 9/11, right? Like what kicked off the war on terror. It technically not a war that we declared, but it was war. The war on drugs was declared against narcotics, right? Intended target was the cartels. The war on terror was very explicitly targeted at a non-state actor community that we attempted to oust and then build a state. And so I think a lot of the folks.
Well, time out though. Time out, time out, time out. You're making it sound like the war on terror was a war against just Afghanistan.
No, it was a war against a non-state actor. We completely.
No, it wasn't. It was a war against a concept. It was a war against a concept, just like the war on
it,
drugs.
it
It's something that
it
can't
was
be
named
fulfilled.
after a concept, but unlike the war on drugs, we did not go and invade Nicaragua. We did not go into Costa Rica, and we have not tried to state build in Colombia or Venezuela.
Not yet.
Pause. Pause.
So,
Okay.
but I don't think I'm going to be the only one out there who assumed that that's what you mean by non-state actor. But I feel like we just vaguely referenced Taylor Swift in a roundabout way there. So Taylor Swift as a non-state actor.
Sure. So, would you?
It all comes back to the Swifties, notorious non-state actors.
Oh, since you brought up Tay Tay,
So like this non-state actor category, we should probably demystify too, because
my favorite subject.
once you put once you put Taylor Swift right next to ISIS, then you also got to throw in a Walmart.
Lord, that's gonna sound fun out of context.
I'm probably gonna take that soundbite and put it
Please,
as the overall advertisement
please
for our
do.
thing on Spotify, so that when people go and look at
This is
Brass Tactics and they click the preview button, all they hear is me comparing Taylor Swift to ISIS and Walmart.
well, I do have an article coming out. Talk and the headline involves Taylor Swift and Hamas and the connection between the two of them. Spoiler alert: there is no connection other than a clickbait
Charlie, I
headline. But
expected
I thought
better
it.
of you
Yeah, I
than
know,
that.
I know, I
My
know.
God, number 5 would shock you.
Indeed, a listicle top 5 reasons why Taylor Swift is just as bad as Hamas. But I think that's an important point you made, Joe, and maybe it's a point for a cocktail conversation. But there's so much more that
Ding.
cocktail conversation. There's so much more to non-state actors than just terrorist groups. I also opine that most major terrorist groups, although we consider them non-state actors, are actually arms of a state. So, so Pete was talking about the Taliban, and their most capable element, the Haqqani network, was a veritable arm of ISI, the Pakistan intelligence service, and that's not only Charlie Faint. If we Google veritable arm of ISI and Haqqani network, you can see who said that originally. So you got Taliban, who's an arm of Pakistan. You got Hamas, as arm of Iran, and the list goes on and on. So, in my opinion, most major terrorist groups are in fact state actors. They're acting on behalf of the state. They're acting on the direction of the state. They're giving support from the state. Non-state actors, and especially in today's world, are more like your Taylor Swifts, Jeff Bezos, people that are not, or at least we assume are not, under the direct control of a government. And I think Taylor Swift is an excellent example, and I'd like to unpack that more if you guys are down.
Oh, always. Very topical.
I have a lot of respect for her. I think she's example number one of why proof of my theory, of my hypothesis about midlife. Tay Tay is number one on the list. So a little background on this. I've been a fan of Taylor Swift for a long time. I'm not talking rabid Swiftie fan, but I do like Taylor Swift. I think she's a very talented musician. Ours, the video that she did for the song Ours really struck a chord with me. The person, her love interest in that video was a 101st Airborne Division soldier. I was in the 101st. I was stationed at Fort Campbell, etc. I also have a daughter who's turning 16 in 2 days, who is all things Taylor Swift. So I went and watched the Eras Tour movie because there's no way I can afford to go to the tour myself. And I think that she's a fantastic example of what someone with a huge following and a huge budget can do and get done in influence.
So how do you leverage that?
Well, you have a militant arm of the Swifties,
Well, right. So sh
and you have informational
like
power. She's big in Japan, so
she
that's
she is
diplomatic.
she is she is not in any meaningful sense beholden to a state, right? So does she just go call dibs on an island and then just have her people flock there? Or is there potential to leverage? So she's got a lot of influence. So what? How do you actualize that?
So, for example, I read an article this morning that Taylor Swift had Kanye West removed from the Super Bowl because they have a beef. And there, we don't need to go into details on it. Anyone who understands Taylor Swift knows the background there. But that's an example. I don't know if it's true or not. I thought I laughed, but that's an example of her using the soft power that she's accumulated to coercively force something someone else impose her will on someone else. So when we look at things that someone can do from her position, she could do whatever she wants. She could run for office in the United States and she could win office. She could be a senator, a congressman. She could do whatever she wants. Maybe she could be president. Things are crazy right now. Who knows? And that's one way that she could take the military and lever of power firmly in hand by becoming commander in chief or House Armed Services Committee, whatever, or simply by using her information power and her economic power to say, hey, I think we should do XYZ. For example, if Taylor Swift were to enthusiastically add her voice to the call for a ceasefire in Gaza right now, that is that is political power that she could influence by her millions upon millions of fans. If she want to put money in towards advertising, et cetera, et cetera. So she can use her soft power to have hard power results.
Beyond the hypotheticals, I think everyone saw on the news Elon Musk's Starlink internet, the satellite internet connection, and how it's being used not just by the Ukrainians but also by the Russians. Now it's coming out to provide internet to control drones on the battlefield, and this is a private company, a corporation, right? It's having very real battlefield effects.
Absolutely. I think it's another example of non-state actors doing things that traditionally state actors have done and probably should still be doing. So why is this private actor controlling the communications for a foreign power that we're propping up to the tune of 120 plus $1 billion? I think we all know the answer why, but that's just another example of maybe a state should be doing that rather than a private citizen.
That's like, well, does the state have the capability now? Because now it's starting to raise questions.
Right.
Just like how it relies on SpaceX for lift, the United States needs Starlink in a way that it cannot provide that capability, which is leading to this kind of cyberpunky future where states are becoming beholden to corporations and private entities.
Well, even now with technology, think about what we could do as private citizens from our own desk with these 3D printers, with connection to the internet, with Amazon, with what you can get off that. So many people can have such an outsized effect just from their own basement.
I've read some people in a joking way, but they're not joking about how the front lines in Ukraine are actually supplied by AliExpress, the Chinese company, the extension of Alibaba, because you can buy just drone kits from AliExpress for a couple of $100 and put it together on the battlefield, put an explosive on it.
My Facebook has been getting spammed by Temu, which I hadn't heard of before, but I guess it's cut rate Amazon.
Yep.
And I was looking through it, I was like, wow, this is some really interesting stuff that's super cheap. So if you were looking to outfit a military or even start your own podcast, you could do it for under $100. It's
So
really interesting.
here's the thing, Charlie. Is this similar to Dimefell, how we're moving away from just outside, beyond the military and economic powers? Is this a symptom of perhaps the deprofessionalization of warfare, the democratization of warfare, where it's being pulled out of the military's hands? The military can't even handle it. It's beyond the military's ability. Look at all these things.
No, it's not. No.
Are you sure? Because that's what the corporations would want you to think.
No, because like Charlie says, we say dime, right? And spying on people and stuff sort of enables the other things. But this is part of why I really don't like this acronym, because it also just reinforces how flawed our foreign policy mechanisms are. And that's sort of an over tip of the hat to a phenomenal research piece called Flawed by Design by Amy Ziegert, which categorically breaks down all of the issues we have, well, all the issues pretty much any democracy is going to have with trying to execute foreign policy. But like Charlie even said, it's the military hasn't suffered from nothing because it always comes back to me. It still has the most robust budget, and you can't change that overnight, which means you probably can't change that because you have 4, maybe 8 years tops if you don't upset enough people. Everything has a military solution if you try hard enough, right? Or at least that's how it seems to be. And we've talked about our first episode was supposed to be about the American urge to intervene, but I spent a lot of time on Sun Tzu. But like this is clearly a theme that we keep revisiting. But I don't think this is a fracturing of the military at all. If anything, it's sort of starting to pivot influences to focus on the non-kinetic means. And here I want to segue to not necessarily a competing frame, maybe a supplemental frame, but I didn't mean to suggest that there's no way to frame war to help under war or foreign policy to help understand. But Dimefil focuses on assets, as Charlie pointed out. And if you're focusing on the wrong assets, then you're not going to be looking for other assets. Another way of looking at war, interactions, competition, what have you, strategy, hard, soft, and sharp power. Rather than focusing on the assets, these descriptors are focusing on the means that these things are exercising. So, like Charlie said, we come back to me. Part of why we come back to me, I would argue, is because hard power is always the simplest solution. Bludgeoning somebody with actual military force or economic force is just the easiest go to button, even if it's not necessarily the best solution. Soft power. Taylor Swift fits cleanly into soft power, even if America has looser control. And for this, Charlie, I don't know if you were ever a gamer back in the day or now, but there was a very popular series of games from Sid Meier's called Civilization. And one of the ways you can win is a cultural victory because everybody starts listening to your music and wearing blue jeans, and you've won. And then last, sharp power. Sharp power is kind of a new one. To Charlie's point, like you sit around long enough, somebody who's on the losing side, like we talked about with innovation all the time, especially with Sean, somebody on the losing side is going to find a creative way. And this idea of sharp power has only emerged in recent years. And the idea is that you've weaponized soft power. It's not just this osmotic cultural collaborative pressure that is just naturally attracting people to you or naturally causing changes so that people are more amenable to working with you. It's going in there and actively messing with somebody's societal norms and standards to which you can. It's attacking or mass brainwashing. What's it called? Social engineering? Is that the fancy term? For getting on social media and manipulating people to turn opinions against you. It's something that China has been accredited for. It's something that's been attributed to Russians. The idea of turning public opinion, in particular against the United States, which the United States is kind of hamstrung with this whole sharp power thing because we've got these like pesky ethics and morals and this belief in upholding the freedom of speech and freedom of information. But anyways, I wanted to bring that up too because I think this is a really good thing to talk about in the same vein as midlife and sort of trying to reconcile how do you account for influences from Taylor Swift as well as from pick any UN recognized country around the world.
Well, your explanation of sharp power is very interesting. I'm not familiar with that. I've been out of the game for a little while, so that's not surprising. But I wonder if it's redundant. We talk about sharp power being the weaponization of soft power. It's all weaponized. That's why it's there. So I think we have hard power, we have soft power. Sharp power is redundant. It's all sharp because we can use all of it, and we should be using all of it, and all of it's being used against us.
Well, Charlie, if we weren't coming up with new names for things that were already happening, then we wouldn't have a community of people with PhDs. That will be my one for this episode.
Well, I mean, fair point because I am the guy that's advocating midlife when dime seems to have been serving us just fine for 100 years. Pete, looked like you're about to say something.
No, 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 no. That
That's
was just
just
me
his
laughing.
face.
Yeah, that's my no, no, no. I'll raise my hand or
Well,
something like
so
that.
I was thinking when we were talking just a minute ago, when I taught international relations at West Point, one of the things that I like to do was go to the international relations guru, Dave Chappelle, for wisdom and insight. And when I was in Iraq in 2004, it was kind of the height of Chappelle's show, and I loved Dave Chappelle's sketch.
Oh, you're talking about the Black Bush sketch,
I
right?
am talking about Black Bush.
Oh,
Sanction me
magnificent.
with your army. Yes, yes, UN sanction with your army. We don't, since all of our mothers are going to listen to this episode, we won't go into the verbiage associated with
Mm-mm.
it. You're welcome to look it up. But I thought that was an excellent example.
I have no clue what we're
I'll
talking
send
You
you
are
a link.
missing out. You're
I'll send
missing
you a
out,
link.
Joe. We got a
And
coalition of the willing, ready to go. Like
Africa
who? Who
Bambaataa.
said that?
Yeah, exactly. That was such a great skit, but so right on. And it goes back to the point we were making earlier, where ultimately it comes down to military economics. So you got the United Nations that is making noise in the skit. It's like, hey, I think you should do this. I think you should do that. And President Chappelle, who's in the skit, was basically saying, "Oh, you should sanction me with your army. Oh, you don't have an army." and then he explained what he thought the UN should do since they don't have an army. But it was is another interesting call. I mean, power is power. You can look at Cersei Lannister in Game of Thrones. Knowledge is great, but power is power, and that's the hard power that you're talking about. Or Joe, as I learned just now, we were going to refer to it as sharp power.
But going back to midlife, in your estimation, Charlie, to bring these I really liked what you suggested we refer to them as these elements of organizational influence. Should our foreign policy complex be established to reflect that? So like diplomatic, that Department of State, great. Information and intelligence, is that somewhere between the CIA or the Office of the Director of Intelligence Agency? Is there a disconnect between how we frame foreign policy influences and how we are currently arrayed to conduct foreign policy?
I think so, Joe. I think bureaucracies in general are slow to respond to just about anything, any changes. Look how long it took us to deal with the internet, and AI is coming on the scene right now, and nobody knows what to do. So it takes a long time for this to kick in. And in terms of who should be responsible for what, I think we have organizations in place to handle all these things. We have a Department of Justice, we have the State Department, we have a military, etc. But I think it's changing the mindset and changing the focus. And when we're talking about midlife and changing the focus, we're talking about strategy. Pete, do you remember what B.H. Liddell Hart said about getting a new idea into a military mind? Are you familiar with that quote?
I believe it was practically impossible to paraphrase,
Yes. So
but
the only thing harder than getting a new idea into a military mind is getting an old idea out, and that's not unique to the military. So when we're looking at international relations theory, when we're looking at politics, nobody wants to think about something new. It's super easy to downplay new ideas, especially if you've hinged your career, you wrote your dissertation on the old idea. So at the same time, I fully recognize that a lot of new ideas are really stupid and we should never try them. But I think that if we start unpacking the kinds of things where we've been successful, where we're not, where we need to go for the future, I think it's more in line with midlife or even dime fill than it is with dime. I think dime will continue to be used because that's easier to use in a soundbite and that's fewer acronym letters that a politician has to remember. I mean, dime is 4 letters. You remember 4 things, you're good. So I think that'll stick around. But I think if we're serious about winning in the future, then we need to expand that window a little bit. And we all need to become more like Taylor Swift because she is clearly killing it right now.
can we talk really quick about what we were discussing a bit before we started rolling about why we are using different terminology when referring to hard or sharp power? Like, for example, instead of saying embargoing a nation, we will now sanction that nation, right? Or provide some kind of a penalty for it.
I'll take this one.
I don't know. I find the semantics really fascinating, just because of yeah.
Well, I think Pete, there may
Oh,
be
all right,
there may be
okay.
a simple answer for that. I think an embargo is an act of war. So if we say we're going to embargo, if we're and someone could fact check me on it, although I'm pretty sure I'm correct. So we're gonna embargo Russia.
Oh,
Oh, that's an act of war. If we're going to sanction Russia, oh, that's soft power. So I think that there might be a deliberate reason why we're not doing that.
you're totally correct. 'Cause we're not blocking all Russian trade. We're just blocking some assets.
Not that either has ever successfully achieved anything.
The British embargoed the heck out of Germany in World War One, and they choked the
What
life out of them.
we embargoed
Hundreds,
Cuba. That worked.
yeah, hundreds of thousands of Germans starved to death during the turnip winter in 1917. Embargoes
They
definitely
took their
work.
missiles and went home.
Yeah, and Iran totally stopped working on their nuclear program. Sanctions typically involve
We
the
literally gave them their nukes back during what was it, the Eisenhower
No, we
administration?
gave them
sanctions
their
Atoms for
money
peace?
back.
sanctions typically involve the imposition of economic or political restrictions, while embargoes involve a complete prohibition on trade or other economic activity.
Ah, I see. So there is a distinction.
You when your list of sanctions gets too long, you just say you've embargoed them.
I like that.
Indeed, indeed. Well, Joe, you were asking about civilization. I'm familiar with the game, but and I am a gamer going all the way back to like paper and 20-sided dice Dungeons and Dragons, so I am very familiar with Civ. And yeah, you can.
What was your favorite character?
I and oh, and Dungeons and Dragons.
Absolutely.
So I play fifth edition now, and I like the warlocks.
Oh, all right, all right.
Back in the day, I had a magic user and an illusionist, so and a thief and a thief. So, but yeah, I like the warlock character. It has a very H.P. Lovecraft feel to it in fifth edition, so that's my favorite. So, yeah, so with civilization, yeah, you can win culturally, but you have to not get conquered by someone economically or militarily first. So unless you're stuck on an island somewhere and no one else can get after you, or your military is so big that no one can mess with you, you're not going to survive long enough to win culturally.
It's a valid point, and nobody's ever won by, for example, everybody listened to Gangnam Style for about 2 months there when that song first came out. But who remembers that now?
Oh, no, 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 dude. K-pop is huge now with the Zoomers and the Gen Alpha, man. McDonald's had their own BTS meal a couple of
Yeah,
years ago.
BTS.
Yes, and Parasite, the
Not
movie, South Korea, dude. They got some powerful soft power.
But Gangnam Style is gone. It did like none of this left a lasting impact. The most BTS has done is reinvigorated NSYNC to launch their their reunion tour.
It's like waves cresting on a beach, Joe. Each wave rises higher and higher and pulls away more sand. Gangnam Style was just the first. Soon the Koreans will conquer us culturally.
Cultural power definitely has potential. It's not as easy to leverage as some other powers. Like I'm excited to read Charlie's upcoming article, but I don't see Taylor Swift standing on top of Castle Grayskull, transforming and then smiting Hamas or what have you, right?
No, I think the best historical example would be Plautus's famous quote, "Conquered we conquer," referring to the Greeks conquering the Romans despite losing militarily. That the Romans wanted to be Greeks so bad because the Romans realized that Rome actually had no culture and had nothing to offer, and they were just a bunch of jerks, and they really wanted what the Greeks had to offer, and so they all just basically LARPed as Greeks.
So the Romans are LARPing as Greeks, while the Greeks have the last laugh being conquered and or dead.
No, I mean not dead, but definitely
I'm sure some of them died when the Romans conquested.
elevated slaves. I mean, oh yeah, a few of them died, yes, and the smart ones would get enslaved to forcibly tutor young Roman aristocrats. But hey, Greek cultural victory.
The Mongolians invaded the Song Dynasty, Tang
China. No, yeah, yeah, yeah,
It was
Northern
either the
Song, and
Song
they
or
formed the
Tang
Yuan.
Dynasty, I can't remember which, but then they go in and
Pretty
they
sure it's
establish their own Chinese dynasty. Does that mean China gets to claim that it has had an unbroken lineage going all the way back? Arguably, yes.
if you listen to Chinese propaganda, you bet your rear end they do.
Yeah,
They totally skip out on all the times they're conquered by the northern tribes.
The Northern Tribe did move in and establish their own Chinese dynasty, though.
Yeah, that's why we call it the
You,
Qing dynasty, right? Not the Manchurians conquering China and forcing all the Han to wear long pigtails.
it was the Yuan dynasty.
Yuan was the Mongols, correct, and then the Qing was later in the 20th in the long they conquered the Ming in like the 1600s. Anyways, you could fact check me on that later, Charlie.
yeah, it sounds pretty accurate.
But I mean, like to the point, that cultural power has a lot to say for it, whether or not it's necessarily tied to a people or potentially a location. Like I'm sure there's implications for Hamas Israel in there somewhere, right? The Middle East has been fought over, especially the area around Jerusalem has been fought over. I mean, it's in the Bible,
Yeah,
and I don't want to embarrass myself any further today, but so there you've had different cultures clashing there forever in hot conflicts and or in just extremely tense scenarios, right?
I think that's a great example that you're giving, Joe, because the the folks in Gaza, Hamas, has very limited economic and military power. They have enough clearly to do what they did in October, but they have so much information power going on right now. I was down in Philly recently, and I was driving around. And I saw this sign or this billboard, and it said "Free the Oppressed." I assumed it was Army Special Forces recruiting banner. It wasn't.
Oh,
It was a
You gotta let
pro.
them know they're infringing copyright, sir.
Well, it wasn't. I made a bad assumption. It wasn't De Preso Libre. It was just like free the oppressed. I was like, oh, I special forces recruiting. Nope. Mm-mm. It was a pro-Palestinian one, and there were several pro-Palestinian billboards throughout Philadelphia. Not only that, pro-Palestinian graffiti on many of the walls downtown. So they are punching well above their weight in some important aspects, especially the legal information right now. They're leveraging that, but they would not be able to do what they were doing if they didn't have that military power. If they hadn't launched that attack and Israel responded the way they did, they wouldn't have all the support right now. So there's a lot going into it, but as we talked about, it all comes back to the coercive aspects, military and economic. If you don't have economic, although they do try with the boycott, divestment, and sanctions, then you're kind of left with the military. And from the military, lots of things can grow out.
In a perverse way, though, like you were saying, Charlie, the Hamas attack against Israel was designed then not to inflict damage upon Israel, but primarily, but to provoke an attack, to
Yeah,
feed the
yeah.
information warfare spectrum of look how badly we are being treated, to add to the body
Some
count.
people would call that cry bully behavior. It's like when your little sister runs over to you and smacks you, and then you smack her back, and then she runs and tells mom and
Mhm.
dad. That's kind of and people will disagree with this, and that's fine. That's one way to look at this issue right now. What they did, what Hamas did in Israel was an atrocity, and it was really shocking to me to see people not only justifying it but celebrating it. But that is a further indicator of the mood of the world right now. I remember watching the recruiting videos that ISIS was putting together, where they're like sawing people off or setting them on fire and stuff. I'm like, oh, this is terrible. But that's inciting people to join them. It's really interesting how that works out. In the context of what we do at West Point, in the Modern War Institute in Defense and Strategic Studies, dealing with cadets or just in general, what this means for them. And what I'm thinking is that we've all heard about the strategic corporal because of the information age that we're acting, that a corporal being kind of the lowest level leader on the battlefield, the decisions that he or she makes has strategic consequences. That's even more so for the lieutenants. So I think that young people listening to this podcast and considering brass tactics need to think about how this applies to them, because we're talking strategy, but this translates directly to tactics. So I think it might be interesting to have a little discussion about that. What kind of elements of organizational influence do you think that the young leaders in the military are going to need to know right when they get out, besides every Taylor Swift song ever made?
From where I sit, Charlie, it's the same value for them would be the same value to just the general American populace as well. The officers, leaders, future leaders more so just because they are so intimately involved in it. Not only they're very much in that that military. And that military is the leading edge and sometimes also the trailing edge and possibly just the only edge to a lot of what we do with foreign policy. Like you mentioned in your article, it's weird to think about. At some point, it just became this is the way. Up there's an earthquake. Where are the US Navy hospital ships to support this island country? Or there's Ebola. There's domestic turmoil here or there. It's becoming easy. Not that I am saying that we should not participate in humanitarian aid missions around the world because that is not what I'm saying. It's just kind of interesting that it became the military's responsibility. And the easy way to resolve that is like, well, we have the military is the biggest. The military has the largest budget of the foreign policy, and so, we haven't picked a war in a hot minute, so we might as well make them do something.
Well, I think also the military doesn't say no. I don't know if you guys were in Iraq or
Well, you can't say no and keep the robust
well,
budget.
that's just not in our culture. It's a culture thing. I remember talking with some of my State Department friends when we were in Iraq trying to sort that issue out, and they kept saying if we had your budget. I think one of the comparisons they make is the State Department's budget is like less than the budgets for the military bands. I haven't fact checked that. I don't know if it's true, but it's
We have more US Army banned military occupation category soldiers than the State Department has foreign service officers. That
that
is
makes more
correct.
sense. But they would say, when we'd have these conversations, they'd say, if we had your budget, if you had our budget, what? You would just fail faster in Iraq.
Dang, Charlie.
Part of the problem that they had was they couldn't staff the embassy that they had because people would refuse to go. So that was a problem, that and the culture that we had is we had a lesser degree on that because we had to start giving people so many uh, bonuses, double below zone promotions, massive retention bonuses financially for soldiers, for officers. But we would go and we do the job, and sometimes the State Department they wouldn't. Also, I want to make it clear I have enormous respect for the State Department, but they were wrong about that aspect. It was cultural, not financial.
I'm sorry, I had lost your original question for a second there, but context. I think that the best thing that these framing tools like dime fill, hard power, soft power, sharp power is to provide context. Know where you are. Especially for those future leaders downrange, right? They especially need to know because they need to know what their left and right limits are as a military capacity, and they need to know what the left and right limits are of the other foreign policy assets and people that are down there. Because if you cannot figure out how to work, like to your point, like with the State Department, if you can't figure out how to build synergy with the State Department, with that diplomatic wing, you're just left a little bit more vulnerable. And that context, I think, is equally important for those at home who they have their preferred news channel and they rely on that news channel not just for what is going on in the world, but to also tell them how to think about what's going on in the world rather than giving them the tools to think about it themselves. And that's what I really like about this episode is context. Your foreign policy has limitations, and there's shortcuts for how to think about and how to frame these problems. And we have these different resources that everybody's aware of, but they don't necessarily see how they click together. And I think that's something that midlife, whether or not you agree or disagree with it, like I originally said, I disagree with it. It is providing that valuable service because it might not be the best way, but it's a darn good start to at least help give you that context you'd need to think about how should I expect our representatives or our government to comport themselves? How can we support other democracies? So this ties to Hamas Israel. This ties to Russia Ukraine. These ties are very convoluted knots that I don't think we are going to unravel in this. So we will definitely have to say more to follow on future episodes. But yeah, these tools don't solve foreign policy and they don't even provide answers to foreign policy. They provide a context, a starting point, and give us a frame of reference for trying to think about these extremely complex and difficult issues.
Absolutely. I also want to make it clear to our listeners, especially the young ones, the military is a solution to pretty much everything, but it's not always the best one. It's not the only one. So even when we're out there on the battlefield in a military context, whatever we're doing, we should be looking at how we pull all these levers to make things better. It's not always good to kick somebody's door down. We just have them arrested or bribed, or you can influence them through their ideology. That might be a far better way to do it. And going back to something that you all talked about before, when you talk about Sun Tzu, the art of winning without fighting, maybe we could think of and encourage our young military leaders to try to win without fighting for a change. That would be refreshing.
A tomato is a fruit, but you don't want to put it in fruit salad, though you could. The military is fruit salad's tomato.
Well,
Indeed,
also, it's the poor workman that blames his tools, right? It's not dime fill. Maybe that's necessarily the problem.
The original one for that military as a panacea is everything's a hammer if you try hard enough.
that's right. That's right. And you alluded to it earlier, Joe. This is probably a subject for a whole other podcast. How the military has become the easy button for everything. And yeah, absolutely, we need to use the military for humanitarian missions. You get a whole ribbon for that. Who wouldn't want to go do that? Sign me up. That's one of the ones I didn't get when I was in the army. But at the same time, there are people who have these missions who should be doing the missions and should be held accountable if they can't do them. So we got the easy button that we keep pushing, keep pushing, keep pushing. One day that button's not going to work, or it's not going to work in the way we want. So I hope we can figure out a way not to avoid that.
I think we broke that button already, Charlie. I think that episode where we talk about the military as the easy button, that's gonna be half of why, where, how, and where to go from here with the recruitment crisis.
I've got ideas on that we probably need to talk about later too. I know the problem. I know the solution, but
Yeah.
that's not what we're here to talk about today.
Mhm.
I'll have to bring you back in a couple weeks after I can put together an outline. I think it's a very reasonable argument to be made that the military was overused, and in some of those overuses, it may have not been used appropriately, and 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 that plays into part of why the military is struggling with recruitment. I don't think it's the only answer because you can also always blame Gen Z for like everything. It's fantastic.
That's the easy button for blaming anything these days is
It's kids
blame it
these
on Gen
days.
Z.
It's always the kids these days. Well, Charlie, is there anything else that you wanted to talk about?
No, I just wanted to compliment you guys on this show. I know that you're only like 5 or 6 episodes in. I think this is a great thing. First of all the way from the title, Brass Tactics. I thought that was really clever. I told my wife tonight, who was also a 10-year Army vet. She's like, "Oh, what podcast you going on?" I said, "Brass Tactics." She's like, "Yes." So I love that. But more importantly, these types of shows, this type of information operation, if you want to look at it, is so important because this can reach people that otherwise wouldn't get it or otherwise wouldn't receive it in the way that I know they do, like on the exercise bike or in the classroom or something like that. So thanks for what you guys are doing. Thanks for having me as a guest, and good luck with your subsequent shows.
Thanks.
Thanks,
I'm
Charlie.
I'm just waiting for somebody to screw up the outro because that's sort of been like a staple
I
hallmark
got
so
your outro
far.
right here. Let's go drink.
There we go.
Yay!